Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be discussing For the Term of His Natural Life by Marcus Clarke. Clarke was born in London but emigrated to Australia in his 20s and has managed to write a really wonderful novel. You can see it's in the classic Penguin edition. For those of you who have not seen me talk about penguins in the past, I'm a big fan of the concept of Penguin books, which is always to deliver classics in an affordable format. And this is an homage to the original style of the Penguin books, which is from a long time ago, over 100 years. Where did I buy this? So I bought this when I was visiting Strahan in Tasmania after I had just toured the former prison settlement there, the remains of it on Sarah Island. And when I was in town in Strahan, I stopped by a bookstore. I couldn't resist. I'd just been where the convicts were. And on a previous visit to Tasmania, I'd been down to Port Arthur, actually, which is another part. So the two, and there's also a part in Hobart. So I've been to all three of the locations that are really featured in this text. And I think that's true sometimes, that you buy a book not because you're going to read it right away, but because there will be a time when it's appropriate for you to read. Now, I don't know what to tell you about why this particular time in my life is why I'm reading this book, but I knew that it would matter to me to read about a place that I love very much. And maybe sometime and on another channel, I'll tell you about why I love Tasmania as much as I do. But for purposes of this review, I want to tell you about this novel. Very influenced by Dickens. Dickens is dead by the time that this book is published, but you see his influence everywhere. And I suppose in a certain way, you see the influence of Dickens in many English authors. It's also interesting in that the book is self-referential, so it'll refer to books like Robinson Crusoe, and then you have an instance of a man building a boat out of goatskins. And it'll reference the Count of Monte Cristo, one of the characters references it, which is about someone who is wrongfully imprisoned. So there's a fun self-referential um, theme going on here, which we wouldn't see in other books, but this is because the book is rather new. I think this is, when was this published? 18 in the 1860s, I think. So rather new, so it has a lot of literary history behind it. So what are we talking about here for the term of his natural life? Obviously, with a phrase like that, it's about a prisoner, someone who is unjustly imprisoned. And we have a small coterie of characters who serve us from the beginning to the end. And there are ways in which the resolutions of certain storylines are Dickensian, but I would argue the ending is definitely not Dickensian, and we'll get to that a little later. But in describing the conditions of the colony, I think if you visited Australia lately, you're not used to thinking of it as a prison colony. You're used to thinking of it in any of the guises in which you may have visited Australia. But unless you visited former places that were attached to the penal system, you will not probably have had a really good introduction to it. On the social condition of these people at this time, it is impossible to speak without astonishment. According to the recorded testimony of many respectable persons, government officials, military officers, and free settlers, the profligacy of the settlers was notorious. Drunkenness was a prevailing vice. Even children were to be seen in the streets intoxicated. On Sundays, men and women might be observed standing around the public house doors, waiting for the expiration of the hours of public worship, in order to continue their carousing. As for the condition of the prisoner population, that indeed is indescribable. Notwithstanding the severe punishment for sly grog selling was carried on to a large extent. Men and women were found intoxicated together, and a bottle of brandy was considered to be cheaply bought at the price of 20 lashes. In the factory, a prison for females, the vilest abuses were committed, while the infamies current, as matters of course, in chain gangs and penal settlements, were of too horrible a nature to be more than hinted at here. All that the vilest and most bestial of human creatures could invent and practice was in this unhappy country invented and practiced without restraint and without shame. So, something that's interesting about the frame of this is Clarke is giving us a fictional story, but cast against a non-fictional background. What was the prison system like? What did the prisoners experience? What were settlers like? What were government officials like? What were clergy like? And In a sense, it's a historical novel in that way. So that's just a little bit about the settlers. Even the settlers were publicly drunk, it seems. But what were the conditions like, and what were the overseers like? Captain Burgess was shutting his veranda window when North hurried up. Captain Burgess, McIlwaine tells me you are going to flog young Kirkland. Well, sir, what of that? Said Burgess. I have come to beg you not to do so, sir. The lad has been cruelly punished already. He attempted suicide today, unhappy creature. Well, that's just what I'm flogging him for. I'll teach my prisoners to commit suicide. And I put an exclamation mark in the note that obviously, if someone is trying to commit suicide, there is a bigger problem there. And what we see so often, not only in the text but in the history, is that conditions were so bad that people chose suicide over continued existence. And this is the same phenomenon that we can see in Palestine, in which people choose suicide bombings rather than continued existence because they see that as a way out. So rather than looking and examining, well, why is it that my prisoner might be committing suicide? He says, well, I'm going to flog him. That'll teach him to commit suicide. And this is a self-perpetuating prophecy, obviously, because if you punish people for trying to commit suicide, that only drives them further down that path, and they've already tried it. Johnson bringing it, the two saw Peter Brown's iniquity set down in the neatest of running hand, and the record of his punishments ornamented in quite an artistic way with flourishes of red ink. This is for a different prisoner than the last citation I read. 20th November, disorderly conduct, 12 lashes. 24th November, insolence to hospital attendant, diet reduced. 4th December, stealing cap from another prisoner, 12 lashes. 15th December, absenting himself at roll call, 2 days cells. 23rd December, insolence and insubordination, 2 days cells. This was 2 days before Christmas. 8th January, insolence and insubordination, 12 lashes. 20th January, insolence and insubordination, 12 lashes. 22nd February, insolence and insubordination, 12 lashes and 1 week solitary. 6th March, insolence and insubordination, 20 lashes. That was the last? Asked Frere. Yes, sir, says Johnson. And then he did it? Just so, sir, that was the way of it. And here Clarke parenthetically adds, just so, the magnificent system starved and tortured a child of 12 until he killed himself. That was the way of it. And I was reading that all to you. I didn't want to reveal to you that he was talking about a 12-year-old. Now, there's something to understand here as well. Clarke is commenting, as Dickens and Austen and other English authors are, sort of the moral bankruptcy of Anglicanism as it started to take on some impurities in and of itself, which of course it has its own problems, but then it takes on Puritanism, it takes on elements of Lutheranism, takes on elements of Calvinism, becomes this soup. But part of the corrupting influence at this time is this idea of prisoners have to be punished. And obviously, there is an aspect of justice when you're dealing with criminality. But there is already a punishment in that person being removed from society and from that person not being at his or her liberty. What happens next is rehabilitation, with the idea this is not just smart financially. You don't want to put prisoners on the tab for the entire population for the rest of their lives, if possible. You want to rehabilitate them, put them back in a society where they can potentially be contributors to society instead of just being a drain on society, not just financially, but morally. So just as important as punishing people for wrongdoing is rehabilitating them. And what we see in this system, this morally bankrupt system, is this toady strange, to be expected from Protestantism, of you are bad, read all these Bible verses on why you're bad, and you must repent. Instead of trying to rehabilitate, treat people like you wish to be treated, and you'll be surprised at how they elevate, as opposed to telling people they're horrible, bad creatures all the time, even though they're already in jail. And guess what? People will rise or fall to the expectations that you set for them. Now, I'm not so naive as to say there aren't such things as hardened criminals who are beyond rehabilitation. But the fact is, we have so many case studies all around the world of systems in which prisoners are successfully rehabilitated. And what we see here is really the sort of dark end of this, in which there's no attempt at rehabilitation, where there's only punishment. And as I say, this moral bankruptcy, not only from the political system, which treats prisoners as non-people, but the religious system from Anglicanism that supports the governing order, which, remember, that's the role of Anglicanism anyway, right? The English people made a choice when Henry VIII took his leave of the Catholic Church, you could say, and they made the crown their religion. And so whatever the king says, Anglicanism is there to basically bless it. And here are some reflections from one of the prisoners, who's one of our main characters. He had wept no unmanly tears at this sudden flow of tenderness in one whom he had thought callous as the rest. He had been touched with wondrous sympathy at the confession of weakness made to him, in a moment when his own weakness had overcome him to his shame. Soothed by the brief rest that his fortnight of hospital seclusion had afforded him, he had begun, in a languid and speculative way, to turn his thoughts to religion. He had read of martyrs who had borne agonies unspeakable, upheld by their confidence in heaven and God. In his old wild youth he had scoffed at prayers and priests. In the hate to his kind that had grown upon him with his later years, he had despised a creed that told men to love one another. God is love, my brethren, said the chaplain on Sundays, and all the week the thongs of the overseer cracked, and the cat hissed and swung. Of what practical value was a piety that preached but did not practice? It was admirable for the religious instructor to tell a prisoner that he must not give way to evil passions, but must bear his punishment with meekness. It was only right that he should advise him to put his trust in God. But as a hardened prisoner, convicted of getting drunk in an unlicensed house of entertainment, had said, "God's terrible far from Port Arthur." And there's an allusion there, too, to the sort of punishments that were going on, that they were unreasonable. You know, stealing some ribbon, you would go to jail. Stealing a loaf of bread, you'd go to jail. And obviously these are disproportionate. These don't make any sense. You don't send people to jail for stealing a loaf of bread or stealing a piece of ribbon. That's not how justice works. So I think something else that I got a glimpse of, which I'm starting to understand a bit more, and I've said this in other reviews, part of why I think Austen's Mr. Collins is so ridiculous in Pride and Prejudice is because that's exactly how Anglican ministers were. And so they represented Christianity to many people, and they definitely represented Christianity as ridiculous because of the way that they thought about things and the way that they acted out. Now, this book begins with a bad marriage, failed marriage, and it ends with a bad marriage, failed marriage. And that isn't to say that's the very first act of the book and the very first last thing of the book. But what I mean to say is we definitely have them as bookends. And I talked about this actually in my last review when I was talking about 32 Yokes and the effect of divorce on a child. We don't have there. One of our main characters, she grows up through this novel, and so she's a child at the beginning. And in fact, a key part of the story turns on the fact that she has her memory blotted out during a desperate time out at sea where they're starving and they're running out of water. And as such, she doesn't remember what happened, and this leads to consequences for the prisoner, which, as I say, I'm not going to say I really am going to encourage you to read this book, but here she is reflecting on that. It was foolish of me, Maurice, I know, but I could not help it. The sound of that man's voice seemed to bring back to me some great pity for something or someone. I don't explain what I mean, I know, but I felt that I was just on the verge of remembering a story of some great wrong, just about to hear some dreadful revelation that should make me turn from all the people whom I ought most to love. Do you understand? I think I know what you mean, says Frere with averted face, but that's all nonsense, you know. And I think Clarke doesn't help us follow that character's journey in which he takes credit for someone else. In the beginning, we see him sort of troubled by this, but years pass and he becomes hardened in it. And I get that sometimes people just do accept the consequences of their evil actions, and they stay it for years, and the regret they push it further and further back in their mind, and it doesn't really eat them alive. But this leads to what started as deception leads to a very bad marriage. He was fond of her, almost too passionately fond for her state or liking, but he was unused to thwart his own will in anything, least of all in those seeming trifles for the consideration of which true unselfishness bethinks itself. Did she want to read when he wanted to walk? He good-humoredly put aside her book with an assumption that a walk with him must, of necessity, be the most pleasant thing in the world. Did she want to walk when he wanted to rest? He laughingly set up his laziness as an all-sufficient plea for her remaining within doors. He was at no pains to conceal his weariness when she read her favorite books to him. If he felt sleepy when she sang or played, he slept without apology. If she talked about a subject in which he took no interest, he turned the conversation remorselessly. He would not have wittingly offended her, but it seemed to him natural to yawn when he was weary, to sleep when he was fatigued, and to talk only about those subjects which interested him. Had anybody told him that he was selfish, he would have been astonished. Thus it came about that Sylvia one day discovered that she had led two lives, one in the body and one in the spirit, and that with her spiritual existence her husband had no share. I wonder how many people are struggling in relationships like that. And this goes back to the idea of, why do you pick someone as a companion for life? What is it about who they are and how they understand you that leads you to make that lifelong commitment? And too often people do not take the time to do the due diligence and ask the real questions and have the real conversations. And this book, I think, does a wonderful job of looking at a traumatic situation that bonded people together, but that's not a sufficient reason to get married. And if we go back to the beginning of this, the idea of true unselfishness, and this is a theme, a motif that grows throughout the book, that love, one of the greatest ways that love can be shown is in unselfishness, is in self-sacrifice. And the main character does this at both the beginning and the end of the book. And that makes it a romantic, poetic ending, but not a Dickensian ending. And I say that because in a Dickensian ending, everything is tied up neatly with some sprinkles on top. Every character has a conclusion. And the way that this ends is it's a romantic ending. In many ways, it's a fitting ending. But there's a lot of loose ends. And I found myself pondering that in the days after I'd finished the book. And I think perhaps if I think about it in the Dickensian frame, then I'm unsatisfied. But if I allow Clarke to speak as with his own pen and as his own author, as opposed to referring to Dickens, which, you know, you can see the influence in the rest of the work, then I can appreciate that it's up to us as readers to conclude, based on the rest of the storyline, what happened to the other characters. And that's fine for me. Because in a sense, I don't need Clarke to tell me how things end. He's put enough pieces in place for us to draw the proper endings for the other characters. As it is, we get the ending for the two characters we probably care about the most. All right, so for The Term of His Natural Life, Marcus Clarke. If you'd like to pick up a copy, you can get a link in the description below. That's one of the ways that you can support this channel. You can also hit like, you can subscribe, you can share this with a friend who'd like to read about literature that is cited in Australia specifically. If you'd like to nominate a book for 2025, you can find my Amazon wish list below. There'll be a link to that as well in the description. And if you'd like to support my work on an ongoing basis, you can always become a YouTube member or join my Patreon. You'll get early access to reviews like this and have a chance to talk with me privately. This year I'm going to be starting to do more private live streams and doing more behind the scenes stuff about how books get selected, how I read, why I read. And I really appreciate the support of the people who already are members. And for those of you who continue to support the channel, even though you may not become Patreon or YouTube members, or you have not become ones yet, I hope that you consider becoming them this year or beyond. Until next time, as always, enjoy your reading.